Welcome to the Brewing Wellness podcast, nourishing UFT members one conversation at a time. Brewing Wellness is a podcast created by the UFT Member Assistance Program to support the mental health and well-being of our members. In order to do the work you do every day and be present for your loved ones, students, and patients, your cup has to be full. Brewing Wellness focuses on mental health and wellness topics that can help us all thrive in our professional and personal lives. I'm Selma Williams, and I'm your host, and we're going to be releasing a new episode on the last Monday of each month. And remember to listen to the Brewing Wellness podcast wherever you get your podcasts. It's available on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and SoundCloud. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Brewing Wellness podcast. I'm your host, Selma Williams. Janice Acosta, our co-host, is also here.
Hello, everyone.
Here with us today is Dr. Jarell Myers. Dr. Myers is a clinical psychologist, licensed in both New York and Massachusetts, with training in cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavioral therapy approaches to treatment. Dr. Myers has expertise in working with adolescents and young adults with comorbid anxiety and substance use disorders and adopts a harm reduction approach when appropriate.
Now, Dr. Myers is no stranger to the UFT and MAP. We first witnessed his genius at our spring Let's Talk About It in the Bronx, where he captivated a large audience of middle schoolers, which is no easy feat. Most recently, he was a speaker at our mental health symposium and also presented at our New York City Clinical Connection. Welcome, Dr. Myers.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here today.
We're thrilled to have you. So today we're going to be talking about anxiety. With the summer being over and everyone getting back into the swing of life, there are many new beginnings on the horizon. So something we hear often from our members during this time of year is that they are experiencing anxiety. Now, anxiety has become very much a buzzword since COVID, but we are turning to you to help us understand it a little bit more. So, Dr. M, can I call you Dr. M?
Sure, yeah, that's cool. I like that.
Or Dr. J?
Dr. J, Dr. M. Dr. J. I've gotten both of them, so I'm cool with both.
I had a feeling. We'll go with the appropriate Dr. Myers.
Okay.
So, Dr. Myers, tell us, what is anxiety?
So as human beings, we are born with a set of emotions embedded in our DNA. It's sort of how we have learned to work overall. One of those emotions is fear. As human beings, we've developed this really positive experience with the emotion fear, one in which we learn that if we respond appropriately to what our body is telling us in those moments where we're feeling fearful, that we'll get a sense of relief. So for example, I hate roller coasters. I'm not a big fan of them. When I am standing in line at Six Flags for a roller coaster, which I do not often do, my heart starts to race and my muscles tense up, and I notice that my breathing becomes more shallow. And my thoughts go from everything else that's around me to thinking about what it's going to be like once I'm on the roller coaster. Mm-hmm. In moments like that, I'm experiencing fear. There's nothing wrong with us experiencing fear. It's actually totally natural and normal. However, when we experience fear over an extended period of time, that becomes a mood state. And the mood state for fear is anxiety. Mm-hmm. So our body is engaging in the type of relationship where for long periods of time, instead of just experiencing fear in the moment and our body's returning to a baseline, mm-hmm. we're thinking about and experiencing that fear over and over and over again. Now, because of the relationship that we developed with fear, we learn that if I avoid the thing that's making me feel fearful, that fear-inducing stimuli, that I'm going to get immediate relief the moment that I do so. However, if I'm feeling anxiety, you're not necessarily getting that relief from it because you're consistently thinking about it. There are these triggers that are consistently happening. So it's hard for you to escape it, right? And so we'll do whatever we can as humans because we're problem solvers. We'll figure things out. We'll do whatever we can to try and get out of that situation, to avoid that experience as much as possible. But because it isn't tied to one specific stimuli all the time, it's hard for us to just completely get away. And so we're in this state of anxiety, this mood state of anxiety.
So it branches from fear.
Yes.
So this idea of like fear, of never really coming out of this fear state.
Right, correct. Yeah.
That's a lot to think about.
Yeah. Well, it's hard. It's hard because I think, again, because of the type of relationship that we've developed with fear as human beings, we've learned I stay away from it. So anything that makes me feel fearful, I have to stay away from. So it's hard when you can't get away from that thing. And in addition to that, if you are so accustomed to getting away from things that you become fearful of, you begin to rely much more heavily on the emotion or the mood state than you do get to stay in control of or stay in the driver's seat of what your life looks like. So for a lot of people who begin to experience anxiety, they're out of the driver's seat, and the anxiety or the fear is telling them what they need to do as opposed to them being able to kind of figure out for themselves what they'd like to do.
Yeah. So I see this most often with clients with social situations, right? Those are having an embarrassing experience. And so they often avoid social situations. So that is also something that we can't avoid, right? Because we are social beings. We have jobs. We go to school every day. Whatever it is that you do, there are people everywhere. In those instances, and similar instances, how do I get in the driver's seat?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So going back to what we were just talking about with the relationship that we developed, we've sort of learned over time that that is a model that we have to follow through on, that I just feel fearful, I get away from it. But we don't necessarily learn what's on the other side of it. So if I stick with it, if I were to stay in line for the roller coaster and actually ride the roller coaster, what happens on the other side of it? If I'm always accustomed to being in line and then stepping out of line when I'm at Six Flags, I'm never actually seeing what's on the other side. And in certain ways, that causes this boogeyman or this monster to kind of grow and grow and grow, right? Because I'm not actually learning anything different. And what I'm teaching my body over time is I cannot tolerate whatever's on the other side of that roller coaster, the end of the ride. I'm teaching myself that I'm never going to be able to get there, so I have to keep on getting out of that situation. In order for me to learn something different, it means that I actually have to go through it. Like, I've got to see what actually happens.
Doing scared.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got to buckle in, and I have to take the slow ride to the top and then take that first dip and go all around just to see what it's like. I'm teaching my body two things in that situation. One is that even though I may be feeling uncomfortable in this situation, I can tolerate it. I can deal with it. And two is that fear does not have to set commands. It can just kind of set a suggestion for me. It can throw something out there for me, and I can end up making a decision on what I want to do or not, right? So if we were to take it out of the realm of roller coasters and take it to things like being in social situations or having to give a speech or something like that, oftentimes we will experience a little bit of fear. I know that I experience that when I'm walking into new situations. I don't know what to expect. There's a lot of uncertainty, but it doesn't necessarily stop me from getting into that situation. So today, for instance, on the car ride over, I noticed that I was feeling a little nervous about what it might be like to sit in front of the microphone and have to talk about all of this stuff. And yet I was able to get out of the car, take the elevator up here, and sit down in the room with you all, right? It didn't stop me. It was more so just a reminder that this is a new experience. So I've changed my relationship with fear and anxiety in this type of situation such that I can hear that it's there, but it doesn't have to stop me from doing the things that I want to do. If I'm hoping to change the relationship that I have with fear and anxiety in social situations, we kind of have to do the same thing. I have to teach myself over and over and over again that even if I'm experiencing something that feels uncomfortable in this situation, it doesn't have to stop me from what I want to be able to do. Now, that doesn't mean that if, for instance, you're nervous about going into a new environment or meeting someone new, that you just go do the hardest thing that you could possibly do, right?
That sounds scary.
No. It's the scariest thing in the world, right? But we can build up to that. So we can push ourselves to be in situations where maybe it's not the hardest, but I can challenge myself a little bit more. I can see what it's like a little bit more. So I've always been afraid of roller coasters, and so going to amusement parks in and of itself was difficult for me. But what I learned was even just going to the parking lot or driving by sometimes, that was hard, but I was able to push myself to do it. And I could plant a flag in that moment to say, I'm able to do that, so maybe I can push myself to do more, right? And so I build up the stamina for tolerating anxiety a whole lot more by doing what we call exposures, right? Putting myself in situations where I notice and experience some anxiety, and I push past it. I show my body and I show my mind that I'm able to do this thing regardless of whatever I may be feeling in the moment. So for someone who's experiencing like social anxiety fears or social anxiety worries, putting them in situations, maybe not at the top of their list, but putting them in situations where they get to see that I can challenge myself or I can push myself a little bit more is helpful over time, because you're planting these flags, teaching yourself that I don't have to listen to anxiety in those kinds of situations.
Yeah. Now I realize that I kind of like put the car in overdrive, and I kind of went to the end without kind of laying some groundwork in the beginning. But it's okay, because we are a podcast that has very natural flowing conversation. But for those of us who might not even understand what that anxiety feels like, right, in our bodies, in our minds, and all the things, how do we identify that? Let's kind of dial it back. And it's my fault. No. And talk about how we identify anxiety.
So that's not an easy question to answer. The reason why is that there are some common symptoms that people will experience, but they're not necessarily associating with anxiety. Fear tends to be one of those primary emotions. So we'll feel that first, and then we may feel another emotion that's associated with it. So people talk about like this fight, flight, or freeze response, right? That fight response, oftentimes we'll see it coming out as like wanting to fight back or anger or being upset, right? But what's underlying that is a fear, right? So that anger serves as a way of protecting ourselves. So what anxiety looks like can differ for different people. A lot of the common symptoms that we'll see is, of course, heart racing, right? You'll feel your heart start to beat a little faster or beat harder. You may notice that your breathing becomes a little bit more shallow because your body's trying to get more oxygen into your muscles to prepare you to do something, right? So when anxiety is activated or fear is activated, in the same way that we've been talking about the fight, flight, or freeze response, it's your body's natural instinct to do something to get out of that situation, because we associate fear with danger often, right? That's where it originally comes from. So if the lion is chasing me, I don't have time to think about what I'm going to do next. My body just needs to do, right? I just need to get out of there as quickly as possible, right? So when I'm experiencing fear or anxiety, my body's job in that situation is just to prepare me to do whatever I need to do. So the way that my body is responding in that moment is in that way, right? My heart is racing, so my blood is pumping faster to my muscles. My breathing becomes more shallow because I'm trying to get more oxygen and oxygenate the muscles as quickly as possible. My muscles tense up because they need to be prepared to go do something, right? To go take care of whatever needs to be taken care of. I'm not able to focus on any one individual thought because the blood is not there, right? It's everywhere else in my body, right? I may even notice that I may feel nauseous, and that's because the blood that would have been there towards my stomach, towards digestion, is shifted elsewhere, right? The most important thing is survival. Digestion in that moment is not important to survival, so my stomach may feel off, or I may notice butterflies or something like that going on. So there are all those symptoms that are occurring, but again, it's how am I thinking about it in the moment? Am I noticing that sitting here in front of you is making me feel anxious, and am I associating whatever my body is physically feeling with that, or am I thinking about it in a different way? Am I seeing it as me just being upset or angry, or I just want to get out of here as quickly as possible because of whatever reason, right? So the symptoms are pretty much the same, but how we think about it, how we're contemplating what it all means, I think plays a role in how we may see what anxiety and fear means for us.
Yeah. I mean, you touched on a very important topic, primary and secondary emotions, right? And I don't know about you, but I know a lot of people who don't know the difference and don't know when they're operating in their secondary emotion. I'm just mad because it's acceptable to be mad, right? Fear is not something that I was ever taught to expose. You're not supposed to know my fears.
Right.
So how do we gently, nudge someone when we feel they might be operating or, living in that secondary emotion as opposed to sitting in that primary and figuring out what the root is of their anxiety?
So I think it's about insight and awareness, right? Oftentimes we as humans don't do a good job of just being in the present moment. We're really good at thinking about what has happened or trying to predict what's going to happen.
Guilty.
But like just being here right now, it's really hard for us to do.
Yeah.
I work a lot with teenagers in doing like DBT,
Thank you for your service.
And so I'll describe the mind as like putting a puppy in your lap. How long is that puppy going to stay in your lap? Not very long at all. That's the way our minds work. If I try to stay in the present, I'll be there for like a few seconds, but then I'm running off to the past and to the future. I'm not thinking about what's happening right now. So the reason why it's so important to raise our insight and our awareness is because we can begin to think about, on a meta level, what was I thinking about in that moment? How is that associated with what I was feeling? What was going on around me in my environment that might have triggered certain things for me, right? So I like to think of it as doing maybe like a post-mortem on what their experience was, because oftentimes when we're experiencing an emotion in a moment, we don't have the mental capacity to go back and think about why I'm feeling what I'm feeling.
No, it's hard.
Yeah, it's very hard to do that, right? And especially when emotions are really high, it's incredibly difficult to be more logical or more reasonable in that moment. But if I can, take a step back and look at that moment kind of from that 30,000-foot overview of what is it that happened? Like, what did I notice occurring? Did I notice I was feeling angry all day? Did I notice I was thinking about this since, over the weekend and it was just sitting with me and it was there and I was tired of it being there? Or what was it that I was angry about, and why was I angry about it, right? Because those are the type of things I think that shed more of a light on what our experiences are and help us to really review why we're reacting in the way that we're reacting or experiencing whatever it is that we're experiencing. So there's no easy road to it, I think, but just about raising your insight and your awareness.
I like to tell people to focus on like the biopsychosocial, to keep it simple. So like the biology, like what's happening in your body, or think about what was happening in your body. The psychology, like what were you thinking or what thoughts were going on. And the social, like is your social meter tapped out?
Yeah.
Like when you're going into the situation,
Yeah.
or like where are you socially?
Yeah, absolutely.
I find that to be helpful.
And it's very difficult to do
It
in today's
is.
society where everything captivates our attention,
Mm-hmm.
and media and all the things they've got it down. They've got us down to a science more than we understand ourselves.
Yeah,
and so
seriously.
there's so many things vying for our attention. I'm going to put myself last. I don't want to feel it's hard.
Yeah.
To
All the algorithms are pulling us. All the algorithms.
I've spent many a night on TikTok when I should have been doing what I should have been doing.
Yeah.
And I feel horrible afterwards, but I know that I was just avoiding that big task, and it even though I was occupied, it didn't yield the result that I wanted, which was to feel comforted. It only lasted for the moment, and then the situation was still there, glaring at me like, you got to fix this. So yeah, I really being self-aware and taking that time to really look inward. We've almost got to budget it in. Like we've got to put it on the calendar. We've got to sit with our therapist, talk to our inner child, calm him or her or they down, and just really begin to see where those triggers start, because the world would be a much better place if we could all just get a little bit more self-awareness.
Yeah.
And you touch a little bit on challenging anxiety and as when you talked about the roller coasters and actually doing it scared. What else you got for us?
Yeah, so you don't have to do this by yourself, right? Anxiety can be very tricky. So I won't go into like the specific details of let's say, the things that I'm thinking about when I'm sitting in a room with someone. But if I notice or I know that it's difficult for me to, let's say, come here today because I'm nervous about sitting in front of you and talking to all of the listeners about what's going on, and maybe I'm worried about them judging me, maybe it requires me to do something to kind of calm myself down before I hop into that situation, because it's important for me to still be here, even though I'm feeling really anxious about it. So maybe it's a phone call to a loved one who I can kind of distract myself with, or I was listening to music on my way in, and that's really helpful for me to kind of take my mind away and allow me to just kind of be present in the moment, not thinking about what's going to happen. So finding effective ways of distracting yourself in the moment, especially if it's really important for you to go into whatever situation you're going into. So being able to use effective skills to kind of help you get through that. Like I said, you don't have to do it alone. So if there's somebody that you can trust in who, can kind of hold your hand through it, you don't want that to happen, in the long run. You want to be able to teach yourself that I can manage it. But, in the moment, if it's really hard for you, having someone there who holds your hand through it, there's nothing wrong with that. And then also I think about sometimes just preparing for it. So there's nothing wrong with gathering as much information as possible just to know what you're getting yourself into. Again, it's not something that we necessarily want to do long term because we're not necessarily going to have all the information in the world. But if for instance, for kids who are starting a new school, I'll encourage them to, go with your parents to the school and walk around as much as possible. See where you're going to be. See if you can figure out what classes you're going to be in. See about the route that gets you there and back so you know what to expect there. If at all possible, see if you can talk to some of the teachers or talk to the principal or talk to a counselor there. But just have that in your bag so that first day isn't about just being thrown to the wolves and having to figure it out, but you at least have some sense of what's going on. You've prepared yourself for it.
Yeah. Setting yourself up for success.
Yeah, absolutely.
I like that.
Absolutely.
And I like, talking to loved ones. That's something that I do that I don't realize that I do. And a friend just pointed it out to me over the weekend. I had to do something on a larger scale than I normally do. And I called, I was like, I have 5 minutes. Hype me up. Hype me up. And, she's like, you do this a lot. And I was like, I'm sorry, but you're the only person that can do it for me, right? Because there are certain people that have that ability, right? To kind of soothe the moment that you're in and give you what you need in that moment. Yeah. She knows who she is. But it's so important to have that village of people and know their strengths and know how you can pull on them in that instant, in any instance you might need.
Absolutely.
So some ways that you share that we can start to challenge or approach anxiety. So we said find a healthy way to distract ourselves from something that's coming up that we are anticipating or having worries about, or have that village, as Selma just talked about.
And do it scared.
Yeah. Although the roller coaster, I have to share a funny story. I have a cousin who is terrified of roller coasters, and maybe we cut this out. We'll see how we feel about this story. But she's terrified of roller coasters, especially the ones that go upside down. Yeah. And my mom was like, "Come on, it'll be fine," and just drags her on. And we all expected her to come off the roller coaster and being like, "That was fantastic, that was great," and she came off. Never doesn't even want to go to an amusement park, traumatized by the experience, right? So that's a way that approaching it went wrong.
Right. And it wasn't her choice; it was yours.
Yeah. It wasn't her choice. Yes, absolutely, right. So if we are outside of roller coasters, approaching it in ways that are healthy and helpful, right? These are two great ways that you shared. Anything else that you add into that?
Yeah, so touching on the roller coaster story, you don't want to overwhelm yourself, right? So you don't want to push yourself to do the hardest thing from day one, right?
Yeah.
And again, this is not information that we just have at hand, so we don't know any better. But as much as possible, if we can build up to it, that's best. Ultimately, what we want to be able to do is get to a place where we're able to tolerate the feelings that we're having. I'm never able to guarantee to an individual that we're going to get rid of your fear of dogs or public speaking or social situations, but that we eventually get to a place where that worry and that fear can be there, but it doesn't stop you from doing whatever you want to do. So in order to get there, we've got to kind of build up your stamina towards it, right? It's like we're going to the gym. If you're going to run a marathon, you're not going to do that without any training. You got to do a little bit, right? And in order to build up to it, you're not going to start out day one by running a marathon. You take a little bites off, and you build up. So that's where we want to be able to get to, having you build up the stamina so that when you're challenged with having to go on that roller coaster, it's hard, but you built up enough stamina that I can tolerate doing that. It's not the hardest thing in the world for me, even though it still is pretty hard. But look, we treat anxiety and fear kind of with kid gloves because we can all identify with the fact that it is hard and it's terrifying when you're in that situation and you want to get out of it. And at the same time, it does not have to rule our lives. So sometimes we got to push back, right? We got to push back. And sometimes we got to push back really hard and do stuff that's hard for us. And it's still will be okay, right? We'll be able to survive that situation.
Yeah, I like what you just shared about facing anxiety, thinking about it as like a marathon. And people train for years to run a marathon. Not ever something I have any interest in doing. But but I know a lot of people that do, and it's a very, very difficult thing to do, and they do it. But absolutely. And facing anxiety is very similar in that manner.
Yeah, absolutely.
So someone's listening to the podcast today and they're like, okay, I'm dwelling in my secondary emotions, or I'm doing things out of fear, and I want to start somewhere.
Yeah.
Where do they start? Where do they go?
Yeah. So I would say if you're able to, you'd want to start with someone who's trained in exposure and response prevention, because that's the type of person who can help you to learn how to deal with or tolerate the anxiety. We've spoken about things on a very surface level, but there are a lot of intricate details that you take into account as an anxiety professional when you're thinking about the type of exposures that you have someone engaging in, or the type of things that you have them do, and when and why and where, right? So you want to work with someone who kind of knows what they're doing and is effective in doing that. One of the places where I think is a good resource for looking at that is the Anxiety and Depression Association of America website, adaa.org, I think is a website. They've got a bunch of professionals there who are registered with that organization, who know anxiety work pretty well as other comorbid disorders, and so work really well with that. So that might be a resource across the country where you can find professionals who'd be able to help out with that. If you aren't in a place where you can work with a professional right now, that's totally fine too. I would say you can start with, what is it that I am afraid of? What is it that's making me feel uncomfortable? What is it? What are the patterns that I'm noticing that kind of come up that make things challenging for me? And are there ways that I can maybe try out or push myself to do something a little bit different than how I'm accustomed to doing it, right? And what can I learn from that? Because that debrief afterwards is incredibly important. Being able to take a look at what just happened and what I learned from that situation, what the worst part of it was, what the best part of it was, what I showed myself that I'm capable of doing, and then when I can try that again, when I can perhaps push myself to do that again, knowing that we all have lives. There's a ton that's going on for us. Our resources are running low just because of the way that the world works right now and what's being pulled out of us, and so it may be harder for us to challenge or push ourselves to do extra difficult things. But if there are tiny ways in which we can push ourselves just to do a little bit extra, that little bit really goes a long way, because it sets a precedent that anxiety is not in charge. I'm in charge, and I get to decide what I'm doing next.
Can I also say, and celebrate those wins when they do happen?
Absolutely. Be your biggest cheerleader for sure.
Yeah.
We believe that over in MAP. We celebrate all the wins, no matter how big or small.
We do.
Maybe over ice cream or something.
Or gummies.
Or gummies. But
like gummy bears.
Gummy
bears.
To
be clear, gummy bear. I didn't realize that has a whole new meaning these days.
Yes. But yes, thank you so much for all those resources. I think that it's the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. I have never actually explored that site, so that's something that I'm going to actually go and do my homework
as well
about after today.
They do a ton of seminars for lay folks. So if you guys ever wanted to take one or just to learn a little bit more, they've got a ton of stuff on the website that you guys can take a look at.
Nice, awesome.
Any other other podcasts or books or anything like that you would suggest or recommend?
So podcasts, I can't say that I'm a big podcast listener.
That's
so
okay.
I don't have
We're cutting this out, Mike.
I mean, of course, this podcast, 'cause clearly we're talking about it here. Brewing Wellness is the main place to come to talk about this stuff. But there are a few books out there. So, oh my gosh, why am I forgetting the name of the book right now? So there are some folks who I could refer you to. They've written books who are pretty good. Dr. Jonathan Abramovitz is one great resource. He does a ton of work on just anxiety in general and how to challenge anxiety. A lot of the stuff that we have out there, though, is limited to, or not limited to, but focused on helping professionals help other folks. So there's not a ton of stuff. Right. There are a few workbooks that you can find, though. So one is for treating OCD, but the idea behind it is pretty much the same in terms of how we challenge anxiety. So treating OCD is a workbook that you can kind of work through and use to kind of challenge yourself and push yourself on your own. And then there are other books like treating anxiety and that type of thing that are similar, that work in a similar fashion. So you can kind of work on your own and pushing yourself and challenging yourself. Yeah.
Okay.
And lastly, someone's listening and they want to find you. How do they do that?
Yeah, so I work for an organization called the Center for Motivation and Change, CMC, and there I do anxiety work in addition to comorbid substance use. I also treat depression, do a little bit of trauma work, all of that stuff mixed up into one. And the best way to reach me there is via email. It's a really long email, so I apologize in advance.
Get your pens.
It is jmyers@motivationandchange.com. That motivationandchange.com piece is all one word. So that's the best email to reach me regarding any work associated with that. And then I also have a small private practice on the side. That email address is Jarell Myers, JarellMyers @gmail.com. So you can reach me there. That's another way you can reach me. Yeah.
And at MAP events in the future.
And yeah, sure, absolutely. Whenever you guys want me to come talk, I'm more than happy to do that.
All right.
Well, we love having you around. Thank you so much for taking the time to actually come here.
Yes.
We're
that means a lot.
Yeah, to be in the studio with us, to record in person. We truly, truly appreciate your time and your expertise. So thank you.
No, thank you so much for having me. This was really a lovely conversation. I appreciated your time and your energy.
Yes. Once again, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Brewing Wellness Podcast. If you are a UFT member, the Members Assistance Program can be reached at 212-701-9620 or by emailing mapinfo@uft.org.